There are three different purposes of classroom assessment that I want to just highlight, and these are actually spelled out in much more detail in some of the resources that are part of the resource guide to this webcast. But the three purposes are assessment for learning, assessment as learning, and assessment of learning. Assessment for learning is when teachers use assessment to be able to understand what it is that youngsters are thinking so that you're able to decide what you're going to do next instructionally. Assessment as learning is actually a subset, if you like, of assessment for learning, but we've pulled it out separately as a separate idea because ultimately what you want are that children can actually self-assess. And by that I don't mean self-mark. This isn't marking their own work. It is that they become good, self-reflective, self-monitoring thinkers in the way that if any of us write, as you write something, if you're writing a paper for a course or even writing a report, you read it and you think about, that's not quite what I wanted to say. You self-monitor, you go back, you rethink it, you add another idea, you reorganize it, that you want young people to become good self-monitors so that they're able to see where they need to go next or where they need to go for help and when they need to go for help. Because we want learning to be a process where they move as efficiently as possible through the learning continuum. We don't want kids to be stuck in misconceptions, misunderstandings, or inappropriate understandings of what it is they're trying to become knowledgeable about. We don't want them thinking many years later that if anyone goes to hospital, that means they're going to die. That can create all kinds of other almost unimaginable weirdnesses in their thinking over time. So assessment as learning is them becoming good at that themselves. Assessment of learning is what we typically do in classrooms. Assessment of learning is assessment almost for accreditation or for decision making. It's when we say we're going to do a report for the parents, or we're going to do a decision about placement or decisions about promotion, that we need evidence to be able to make those judgments and make those judgments well. The graphic of the triangles shows two different triangles. One that is the, if you like, typical balance or current balance of assessment for, as, and of learning. And the other one is the one that I'd like to suggest we should be working toward. That at the moment, most of the assessment that we do in schools is assessment of learning. It is assessment with the purpose of reporting, communicating, accrediting, making those kinds of decisions. That most teachers do assessment for learning, as in they collect information about how kids are learning various concepts, often done informally, but you do it in order to decide what you're going to do next. And assessment as learning, intentionally working with young people to help them get good at judging their own learning, happens rarely. It's usually something that happens when it jumps out at you in a day, because teachers work through whole days of making constant decisions. You're making decisions in your lessons all the time, and you're changing the lessons depending on kids. What you may not be doing is working intentionally to create in them that capacity and the automaticity in monitoring their own work, thinking about where they need to go next, asking for help or getting help in a variety of ways. So I'd like to think that the balance should actually flip on its head, that assessment as learning should be the biggest part of the pyramid, that assessment for learning should sit on top of that, and that assessment of learning should actually happen fairly rarely. It may include a lot of evidence from across a whole term or a whole unit of work. It's not that you don't pay attention to all of the information you collect. It's that each time you do assessment, it is not a decision point. It can be a learning point. The next slide is called Planning the Assessment Process. And what I'd like to do is go through that slide just as it's an organizer, it's a way of thinking, to say when you're planning your assessment process, what should you be thinking about? Because you should always be assessing with the end in mind. What am I going to use this for? Why am I doing this assessing? So you start with, why am I assessing? What is the purpose? Am I assessing at the moment so I can decide what I'm going to do differently? Am I assessing so that I can help students become better at making decisions about their own learning? Or am I assessing because I have some communication I need to do, where I need some solid evidence to be able to do that and feel confident that I'm giving good information to someone else or making a good decision about this student? Once you know why you're assessing, and many of you will say, I do all of these things and I do them all and I mix them all up together. And in fact, you probably do. But as you try to actually deconstruct them, one of the things that happens is that when you do things for one purpose, you actually can make it hard for it to be useful for another. Now, let me give you an example. If what I want to do is get kids to self-assess, if I want them to start self-monitoring or to be engaged in self-monitoring, and I'm going to mark that and it becomes part of what counts, why would I as a kid be even remotely willing to share with you, the teacher, what I don't understand? Why would I be willing to make that visible if you're going to use that against me when you mark me? So you need to create the conditions where kids can actually feel comfortable doing self-monitoring and not being right. Because in fact, lots of the time that we're learning, we're not right. That's what learning's about. If you knew it already, if it were already comfortable and automatic, then it wouldn't be part of what you're trying to accomplish. So you need to think about why you're assessing really clearly up front. Then you need to think about, what am I assessing? What are the curriculum targets? What are the skills? What is the content? What is it that I'm trying in this case to accomplish with this group of kids? Because if you aren't clear about what that is, you can be distracted by all kinds of other things that are going on. I'm going to give an example a bit about that in a minute. Then what assessment method will I use? Often asked, so what kinds of assessment methods do you use for assessment for, and what kinds of assessment methods do you use for assessment of? And the answer is all of them for all of them. There are not better assessment methods for each purpose. It's how you use the assessment that you do for the purpose that you intend. It's matching them. So you can use worksheets for assessment for learning. You can use tests to unlock what it is they believe to be true. It's not the form, that it's what you're trying to do with it, and then getting the best form for what it is you want to do. How can I assure quality? I'm going to come back to the quality question later, because I said earlier quality is an important piece of this that we really have to, I think, in education pay more attention to. That we actually don't necessarily think about the quality of our assessments as much as we might. Then what can I learn from this assessment? And you'll see there are two different tabs here. What can I learn from this assessment, and what am I going to do with it? Those are different things. What can I learn from it is, what is it that I'm learning about this kid or group of kids learning? What is it I now know about how they learn that I didn't know before? Then, how am I going to use it? Is what does that trigger in terms of teaching strategies, resources, support, whatever kinds of things you might bring into the picture to decide how you're going to move on. So let me back up for a minute and talk about assessment for learning. Assessment for learning now is the one where teachers use the assessment to decide what they're going to do next. Identifying what it is they believe to be true. This is where you get specific information on each student's learning paths. I suspect you now in many of your classrooms have got assessment walls and you're starting to track kids' learning as they move through. Is that true? Yeah? This is being clear. What are the curriculum outcomes? What are the things we're trying to accomplish? How does that show itself? How do I then make sense of that? It gives you detailed information on prior knowledge and on misconceptions and on errors in thinking. You need to know the learning progression. You need to know the common misconceptions. And you need to design the assessment to allow you to actually unpack that information. Here's a pretty good example of that. This is place value in decimals. It's the next slide. If you put a question on a worksheet that's place the following numbers in order of smallest to largest, and what you're after is the kids' understanding of place value. You've got 4 numbers there, 0.01, 0.67, 0.931, 0.32. I'm sure all of you can sit here and order them right now from smallest to largest. And you might, from that, assume, if kids could do that, that they understand place value. But if you look at those numbers and you take out all the decimals, it would order exactly the same way if all they did was look at them as if they were whole numbers. They don't have to understand place value to answer that question. The next one, however, select the largest number from the following list. The largest number, if they take out the decimals, is 125. The largest number, if they understand place value, is 1.4. So you need to construct assessment items so that they allow you to see the common misconceptions. What is it that kids would do if they didn't get this? And there may be 5 or 6 different ways that they could misunderstand place value. What you want to do is to be able to identify which ones have got the concept solidly in hand, which ones don't get even decimals, which ones perhaps understand a little bit about it, but they get confused when they have whole numbers and decimal places. Why do you want to do that? Because you can't teach every single kid one at a time, but you can teach 3 groups that concept by grouping those kids into those who need this kind of instruction, those who need that kind of instruction, those who need even to go back to number facts. You can make those kinds of judgments if you create your assessment items in ways that they give you insight into what it is they believe to be true. So when you're using assessment for learning, what you want to be able to do from that learning, as I say, is grouping. You want to be able to group them for instruction so that you can differentiate your instruction. And it's by continually checking where each student is, and then you do grouping and regrouping and regrouping and regrouping, depending on the concepts, the ideas, the learning expectations that you're working on. You also want to be able to provide students with very accurate descriptive feedback. The feedback loop in learning is the most powerful part of this assessment activity. It is, as soon as you know what it is they misunderstand, creating the conditions for them to see what they should do next so that they get it, so that it's actually a successful next step in their learning. It's not just either, and we've all experienced this, that was really good work, you got 19 out of 20, but you still don't know what you did right. Or what's even worse, struggling with this. Pay more attention to your homework. Practice. But without insight into what it is they don't get. That feedback needs to be very specific, very direct, and allow the students to make sense of where they are and where they want to go. I'm going to give you a little example from some time that I spent in England. with a team who were working on the national literacy and numeracy strategies there, and we had this great privilege of being able to sit in classrooms all over England and watch teachers teach the literacy and numeracy lessons in the strategies. Sat in one that was particularly good, and I'm going to give you it as an example of using assessment for learning. What the teacher did was start the literacy hour, as you may know, has a kind of three-part lesson. It starts with a group activity, and then they go off and work in smaller groups, and then they come back together for a full class at the end. In the first part of it, they were looking at a book. They were doing, it's kind of a big book, and it was reading, looking at the title, trying to predict what was going to happen, typical beginning activities. The curriculum target for the day, and you notice I'm saying curriculum target, they also had numerical targets as we have in Ontario, but they very quickly moved from where are we on reaching our numerical target to which of the curriculum targets are each of our kids achieving. So it's very much about instruction and about expectations, about learning. The curriculum target for the day was on using expressive language, particularly adjectives, in written work. And what the teacher did was to talk about what adjectives were, what expressive language was, in terms of using an adjective, using expressive or figurative language is a way of making something come alive, making people be able to see it or hear it or smell it or feel it by having words that made it work for them. And then had just a wonderful little activity where she put a bunch of, the story was about vegetables. So she had a bunch of vegetables, and these vegetables were taking over the garden. A bunch of vegetables, and asked them to think about words that would describe these vegetables. So somebody said it was a massive tomato. Okay, why did you choose the word massive? What does massive tomato conjure up for people? What might the massive tomato be doing? So it was all about building this figurative language. One of the kids said it was a nice carrot. She didn't accept that. It was, well, nice is an adjective, but is it figurative language? What does nice tell us about the carrot? What are some better words? And it's in that feedback. So her questioning was the assessment, was what do kids understand? So you can see how assessment and instruction start to weave together. What's different is she's doing it very, very intentionally. She had planned this to be sure that she was going to get information from all of the kids in the class about their understanding of figurative language in that first little interchange with them. Then she had 4 different groups that they were going to work in. She worked with one very intensively. The other 3 were actually working in quite different ways based on some prior work that she had done. Some of them were actually just replacing words with different words. Others were writing whole sentences using figurative language, depending on how she had unlocked in advance what it was they believed to be true. This is also important when you start talking about providing information to parents. Parents don't always just want to know, how's my kid doing? They want to understand what it is that kids are getting and not getting. And in the same way that very concrete stories and descriptions make sense to you, that's what makes sense to them. Talking to them about what it is you're learning with examples of what it is their children are doing, not as this is an A paper or this is a 19 out of 20 paper, but as this is the kind of learning, this is what I'm doing, this is what you might be doing, can be very powerful in promoting that learning cycle. Now let me move to assessment as learning. And I said that assessment as learning was a kind of a subset of assessment for learning. It is promoting self-reflection and self-regulation. It's in the metacognitive sense, that highest level of self-regulating your own thinking and your own control of your thinking and your learning. Kids are never going to be good self-assessors if we don't teach them how. Most of us have never been given instruction in being self-regulated learners. Most of us have learned how to do that as adults. Many people never do. But we want kids to take that on as a way in which they learn. So first thing we need is to have explicit goals and processes for monitoring progress toward them. We need to have goals that are out there that they can see so they know what it is they're working toward. And we need to give them ways of moving toward it, of checking their own. That's where things like exemplars come in. Not just single exemplars, but lots of exemplars. Some of you may even have been in, I think, the grade 13 a number of years ago, when the writer's craft was the 5th credit in grade 13 English. The writer's craft document had in it an absolutely wonderful set of examples, because it had examples of literature that had been written by famous Canadian authors, showing how they self-monitored and self-regulated their writing. How Margaret Atwood took her first scribblings and then started to develop it and went and did more research and came back and changed and reorganized and all the things that she does as she writes, as a way of helping those young adults in grade 13 become self-regulated learners. We need to think about what is the scaffolding, not only for the learning, but the scaffolding for learning how to monitor your own thinking along the way, for knowing when you've got it or when you're not sure or when you really need help. So they need information. There's feedback here as well. Feedback about how well they're doing at their own self-reflection, at their own judgments about their learning. The example that I want to talk about in this one is actually in a document that I've left that people can have a look at, and it's in the resource guide as well, that is called Rethinking Classroom Assessment with Purpose in Mind. And it's an assessment story. I'm going to tell you just a piece of it. It's a teacher who started out at the beginning of a lesson on fractions with a set of 6 carefully developed questions for the students to do to show how they understood fractions before she started teaching. What they did when they were doing that, they each tried to do the questions. They wrote down their thinking as they went. They met with a math buddy, and their responsibility with their math buddies was to explain what they thought this was about. And the math buddy's job was to ask questions for clarification, for deepening understanding. So not to give fixes, to ask questions. At the end of that session with the math buddy, the teacher asked the kids to take colored dots and put a green dot on the ones that you're sure you've got. You've figured this one out, you got this one sorted. Yellow's the one where you're not sure about. Red is the one you're really struggling, you don't think you've got it. And she collected those and took them home. And her time was not now correcting a bunch of worksheets. Her time was looking at the thinking on the ones that the kids had identified with red and seeing who those kids were and where they were struggling, so that she could decide what she was going to do next in instruction. So you see how it's embedded? She not only is helping them learn how to be good self-assessors, but she's giving them some tools for doing that. She's using it to decide where she's going to go next. If you're going to do this, then you really do have to model and you have to guide self-monitoring. It won't happen on its own. You have to provide regular and challenging opportunities for kids to practice doing it. Because if they aren't practicing it, it doesn't become an automatic part of what they do. You want them to see it as something that they will do even when they're not asked. But that's a long, slow process. You have to monitor their metacognitive processes, monitor how they are doing it, and give them the exemplars, the learning progressions, the rubrics, the things that they need to be able to have these tools to make judgments about their own work. And finally, you have to create an environment where it's safe. Because if it is not safe for them to do that, why would they take it on? What you want is to create those conditions where they can actually become good self-assessors and do that in a way that they are not embarrassed, are not going to be centered out, where not knowing is not a bad thing. It's where you are right now. And our job then collectively is to help you know, is to move that next step as efficiently as we can do it. Now, assessment of learning is the certification and accreditation of performance. It is a summary of each student's level of achievement, and it's the foundation for decisions and discussions about placement or promotion, reporting. And because I'm going to move fairly quickly into talking about quality, this is high stakes. Assessment of learning, which we have done in education in a pretty cavalier fashion, is actually really very high stakes for those kids. It is what, on the foundation on which they build their self-esteem, their sense of themselves as learners, their sense of themselves as having value or worth, because their job is being in school. Their job is learning. And if they aren't learning and they know they aren't learning, and that's being repeatedly pointed out to them in a series of marks on papers, that has a huge impact. For some kids, it means, do I get the bicycle or not? You know, do I get the summer holiday or not? There are all kinds of things that get attached to those decisions. So if we're going to make those kinds of decisions about kids, my caution is we better be very sure that we have high quality assessment on which we're making those judgments, because these aren't trivial. These are important. It has to be fair. It has to be accurate. And it has to be based on detailed information that you have some confidence in, that you can use to decide what you're going to communicate. So a graphic in the pack that is on the teacher's roles. I'm not going to go through those in detail, but you can look at them and think about them, about the ways in which teachers actually shift their behavior depending on whether you're doing assessment for, assessment as, or assessment of learning.